interest, and this will be a useful sort of it's a sort of use of time for you guys. Like I said, I have a great panel, and I think there'll be a good like sort of diversity of opinion here. We just wanted to, before I can move on to the panelists and introductions, I wanted to ask the room how they would define surveillance. So we can sort of get like what do you think surveillance is? If you had to define it in a sentence, for instance. Any volunteers? Okay. Is it no one? I think it's just too simple of a question, maybe. Yeah.
Just a volunteer. Surveillance is, I think, for me, is illegitimate access to the information.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's perfect. Okay. And can somebody like maybe give us like a few examples of surveillance? Like what would constitute surveillance? Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if everybody heard, but like walking down the street and feeling that you're being watched and there's eyes on you. So that feeling of being watched. What else? Hmm. So a lot of concerns about social media, and like we'll be discussing all of these. So what I did one of those things where like you expect certain answers just to make your point. So usually when we talk about surveillance, we don't we no nobody mentioned the identity of the person being surveilled. So nobody mentioned you know, he or she or what person, what social class they come from. But we always have assume that there is a certain person to be surveilled, and then that person inevitably, most of the time in our discussion, subconsciously, is a man, is probably straight, and probably like is aware of their rights, or like comes from a particular class. And for some people it might be white or whatever, like your within your context. So then we do our analysis based off of that, what we imagine the surveilled to be. So a lot of the times we don't realize that surveillance has differentiated impact on different people on the basis of their identity. And that's something that we want to discuss here and sort of explore. Hopefully we can sort of get into the meat of it also, because it's a very vast topic, because we're talking about multiple identities here. But we really wanted to take, when we think of surveillance, we think of the state, for example, or now increasingly social media companies surveilling you. But we really want to explore how the identity of the surveilled then changes the dynamics of the surveillance itself. So we have an excellent panel here who are going to touch on like different aspects of that surveillance. So the title of the panel is From a Feminist Perspective, but we're not just talking about gender. Obviously it cuts across class, even age, like some people are more susceptible, religion, what your ethnic minority is, and sort of like basically what your body is, and that becomes a site of surveillance. I'm going to start. So I'm going to introduce my panelists first. And also in the order, I think that I'll be asking the questions from them. So we have Valentine, who is the head of, who is part of the sexuality project, erotics at APC. Then we have Mahitaladhibesra, who is an adjunct faculty at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. She's also a dear friend, and I've known her for a long time. And she's now a JST candidate at the University of UC Berkeley. So very glad, and she's also a lawyer. So I'm gonna ask her like a lot of pressing questions about the legal aspects of it. And then we have Anki Das, who is a public policy director at Facebook. And she's going to be talking about, so we have a lot of questions about social media companies, and it's great for her to be here and sort of answer the concerns, the types of concerns around surveillance that were just raised here. So I'm going to start with you, Valentine. So because we're talking about surveillance, but I think the definition of surveillance is very important. So if you could talk about what we mean by a feminist perspective to surveillance and how that changes the overall definition, and maybe talk about some of the work that APC is doing around it and how that can inform everybody else's work, because a lot of us deal with the issue of surveillance in one way or the other.
Good afternoon. Very happy to be here. Can you hear me? Yes. Very happy to be here. So I think that when we started and we talk about surveillance and feminism, we should say and then ask what is feminism. And I would say that feminism is a political lenses. So I have a -5 and -6. I don't see anything. When I put this, I got my side. This is a feminist side. And feminism, it's politics. It's a way you look at the world. And it's embodied. With me, it's more white than with many of you. And sometimes it can be too much clean because there are privileges in my whiteness. Of course, there are also degree and scale of whiteness. But feminism is a political lenses to the world. And it's based on solidarity and recognition. It's not judgmental. That's why feminism is not only about women. That's why feminism can be about LGBT. That's why feminism can be also about men, straight men. Because feminism is a movement of liberation. And we very often forget. And so if we put these two things together, feminism and surveillance. Surveillance, it's related with the many myths. I think the surveillance is so old. We all have always been surveilled. We had been surveilled when we were born because we were so small, so unable to move, to crawl, that we were surveilled. Yes, we had been loved and surveilled with love, but with the implication that we were minors, unable to move ourselves, unable to understand where the risks are. So we all are surveilled. But then when we grow up, there is a big difference, and by this difference is related to gender. The gender that can be genitals, but the gender that are also representation and mirroring. Am I a woman or a man? Can you tell? Just looking at me? You can just project your idea, but you don't know, until I don't disclose, until I don't define myself. So we all are surveillance, and surveillance has an implication of minority. We are looked at because someone has to take care of us. And now I would say women, and I say women specifically, have a long, long, long history of being surveilled. We know this. And this experience, this living experience, is the one that makes us able to talk more than anyone else. And we know the surveillance is always been normalized. Why? Because the women's are minors in many cultures. In some, we have secularized the culture and we are less minors, but anytime something happens, there is a crisis, we come back to be minors. We need to be protected. It is in the offline world, it is in the online world. In the online world, in the social media and other, we have to be protected. And protection become with filtering, blocking, controlling. Very often in this society, surveillance is linked with autocracy and dictatorship. But surveillance is a very ordinary state of mind. And we also participate in surveillance. Tell me if in your life you never had spied to some friends of yours. Looked what he or she was doing at night. Looked where of she was going at night. We are all a voyeurist society, and we are very judgmental. And sometimes we can create harm to the others. So it's also important to understand that we are part of a surveillance system. But surveillance and power and technology make a big difference. My power of surveillance, it's ridiculous compared with the power of surveillance of government and, I would say, big tech corporation. Why there is a need of normalizing surveillance? Because if we normalize, then we are all under control. But as the feminist movement, as women, fight against surveillance, because surveillance about the fight against surveillance is the ability to decide to be invisible and not to be constantly under monitor. And this ability can be in everyday life or can be for very important things. So that's why it's important to feminist lenses. Neutrality doesn't exist. Neutrality is equal to men, usually white men, or in any society the ones that control the power, the ones that have power. Without power, we cannot discuss about anything, because power, it makes the difference. We have now technology that empowers surveillance and gives surveillance an easiness that never had happened. And sometimes we just give our data freely. Sometimes those data are vested without us knowing or against our will. But again, we are surveillance for our good. But the good of who? We are surveilled because we are part of a specific business model. It's a capitalist model that make all our data, all single data, come together, becoming very, very rentable. It's a marketing. We are a market. Each and every of my data, it's there for a market, not in its singularity, but in our complexity. And those big data are not harvesting by case. They have priorities. An algorithm is a specific vision of the world, amplified to a sophistication that only machines can handle. But the data had been input by real people. And now those people can happen to be women, engineers, but to which system of values they belong? I would say patriarchy. And this little world can create an earthquake, because it's where things become different. So that's why we need to have a feminist lens, because we have keyword. Surveillance is linked with gender, with sexuality, with race, and then all the other people, and with privacy, and with anonymity, and with consent. Just the last. So what is really important is that when we talk about surveillance, we don't talk in the vacuum. That when we talk about surveillance, we always know that there is an everyday surveillance that is constantly disregarded. You have a partner. It's very cheap to surveil someone. Mobile phones are the best tool for surveilling. Partners surveil partners. Parents surveil their daughters. And daughters are not surveilled for their security or safety. They are surveilled for the honor of the family. It's an asset. It's not love. Let's not say lie to us. There is love, but love do not surveil. Love talk. Love ask. Love provides safe space where we can discuss. Surveillance is control over. Control over, it's about power. Government, corporation, they all are after their own power. Power of money, power of the people. We are the people. And we need a feminist lenses, a feminist political technology to act at the level of the code, at the level of the design, at the level of the use, at the level of the policy. Because if we are not in each and every space with a political lens, a lens of solidarity, we will be washed up. And I finished here now.
Thank you so much for that. And I think something that you raised a very good point about because we don't apply a sort of a feminist lens to surveillance a lot of times. We miss certain kinds of surveillance that is happening. So when we talk about surveillance, we're very quick to talk about the state that is surveilling. But what about social surveillance that we do of each other around us, and especially that what you were talking about partner surveilling another partner, and that's also a power dynamic. But we usually miss it because our lens is a little different. So that's the sort of layer that the kind of perspective that you are offering. It allows us to pick up certain kinds of surveillances that we are missing. Now, then I'll move on to Mehtab, and sort of I'll sort of ask you to also maybe give posit a definition of surveillance and how you see it as through a feminist lens, and maybe also talk about how other issues that it affects. So it affects privacy, and so for example, data protection is something that is usually posited as a solution. And do you think that's a viable solution? And maybe talk about the context in which you work, which is South Asia.
Thanks, Shumaila. I think Valentine gave us a very good overview of the power structures that define surveillance from a feminist perspective. I subscribe to a similar definition whereby I believe that the concept of surveillance and privacy does not take into consideration the experience of women and minorities and people from disadvantaged groups. This has been manifested offline in many ways for as far as we know. Human history dates back, but even in the online spaces, it has started being manifested in very unique ways. So I'll talk a little bit about the kind of ways that it is manifested in South Asia. I'll use some examples from Pakistan, and I will try to give my perspective on the law and policy side of surveillance and what's missing and what the consequences are, even when we do consider the gendered perspective on surveillance. So I think that the organization that Shumaila is from, Digital Rights Foundation, has done extensive research on surveillance of women and their experiences online to illustrate a broader point, that the experience of women is essentially different. And as my colleague has explained, surveillance is something that has come to the forefront in the online space because suddenly everybody, that includes people in power, are feeling like their lives are being intruded upon. So it's a political issue because everybody's phones are being tapped, everybody's emails are being recorded, whether it's a state-sponsored agency or somebody trolling you on Twitter, everybody's susceptible to it. But this kind of experience of being watched, of being made to modify your behavior, this is something that women and minorities and disadvantaged groups are not strange. They're not strangers to it. When women are out in the street, they might fear what time they're out at, what they're wearing, who they speak to, and depending on the cultural context, what they're wearing. And this kind of behavioral modification and censorship is manifested online as well. And the way that women experience online platforms, especially when it comes to expressing themselves or being in a professional field like as journalists or activists, they are targeted in specific ways. So the DRF found that through their helpline that was established about 6 months ago in Pakistan, that it was open specifically for victims of cyber harassment online. And there is an inextricable link between surveillance and harassment, because surveillance is continuous, but you're being surveilled because you're subject to harassment. It is being subjected by bots or trolls online on Twitter, harassing you. In the example of Pakistani women journalists specifically, if they speak against the government, certain kinds of accounts start attacking them, certain kinds of people start attacking them. Female journalists have taken this as given, as this, they think this is inevitable. They've accepted it as part of their online experience, which is kind of sad because nobody should have to accept that this is the norm. And nobody should have to be subjected to gendered slurs, attacks on character, attacks on your personal lives just because of the race, class, gender, or religion you belong to. And this is a manifestation that has been found online, and this is a result of continued surveillance. Another example, coming back to the helpline that was established, this was established specifically to help the victims of cyber harassment. Now, this is not limited to just women, but it does show that certain people, majority of whom are women, experience harassment on a regular basis, and it has been shown by the majority of cases being from women for help from the DRF based on harassment. But the sad part is that even when they do report it or they seek help, the majority of them would not go to the relevant legal authority. So there is an established legal authority in Pakistan that deals with harassment cases, online harassment, but the majority of people affected by this said that they would not go to it. They would not report it. They would not seek help, either because they feel embarrassed or they don't trust it. They don't trust the system to help them, which is a good segue for me to discuss the policy and legal implications. So, surveillance on its merits has not even been considered by US courts, even though the revelations of the NSA surveilling US citizens en masse were revealed several years ago, but it has still not been considered on its constitutional merits. Pakistan is no different. We have not really considered whether the right to privacy, which is embodied in the Pakistani constitution, is violated by surveillance. But surveillance has become an integral part of the law that has recently been passed. So the laws that deal with cyber crimes have certain provisions that on the face of it seem to provide some appeasement to victims of harassment, but instead of getting protection, you end up being surveilled even more. So I'll just quickly tell you what the provisions of the law are. So the Pakistani Electronic Crimes Act criminalizes behavior like stalking, sending pictures or messages without consent, sharing intimate pictures without consent. It also criminalizes simple acts like contacting someone when they don't want to be contacted. It is intended to protect women, but within the same framework are certain practices that have been instituted that will ensure that not only the disadvantaged groups are subject to even more surveillance, but everybody as a whole, whichever citizen, whether they're in power or not, is subjected to more and more surveillance. So the act actually legitimizes the collection of data from telecommunication companies for over a year, and requires them to retain it for a year. And they can seek that data without informing the person in question. They can take that data with a warrant given by the court on undisclosed grounds and seek data about a person basically whenever they wish. So because this has been institutionalized, it's very questionable whether law and policy, at least in Pakistan, is being framed in a way that it would make online spaces safer or less scrutinizing for women. I'll just quickly take a little bit more time talking about privacy. Should I do that now or like? Okay. So answering your question about whether privacy protections will necessarily result in better experiences for women or less surveillance for disadvantaged groups, I think privacy protections are only part of the solution. And that's where I want to relate it back to the offline space. So we all know that sexual assault is wrong, that slurs that are gendered towards women's characters are wrong. But still we see that rapes and sexual assaults, whether they're in the developed world or the developing world, are underreported and underprosecuted. So even in the offline space, even though it is part of the law, it's wrong, but people are still not attuned to accept a woman's word when she says that she has been assaulted, or she's not comfortable going to the relevant authorities and reporting it. Similarly, online, even if you have a protection under a privacy law that states that women don't need to give out certain data, or if platforms were more responsive to women's complaints, even then I feel like there needs to be a larger cultural shift that recognizes that the rape culture exists online too, and accordingly people modify their behavior towards disadvantaged groups that include women in order to make it more inclusive. Law is not enough.
Thank you so much, Mehtab, for that. And and also, like you were talking about the sort of study and the link between harassment and surveillance. When we interviewed a lot of female journalists for our study, we found that, and we wanted to compare them to their male colleagues, and a lot of times the kind of surveillance and its effects on the male colleagues was very different than the women. So when when a male colleague journalist wrote a controversial story, for example, in the context of Pakistan, something to do with like blasphemy issues or extremist violence or the civil-military relationships, they would get a either threatening call from the agencies, or they would probably be just roughed up, like sort of, I don't want to make light of it, but picked up for a while, and then but with women it was very different, because the kind of the surveillance that the state would extend to them would be a phone call which wouldn't say your family would be in danger if you continue talking about this. It would be like, you live in this society and we know that you talk to men sometimes, so that can be used against you, so maybe keep that in mind next time so they're using the patriarchal structure and the notions of and expectations of what your gender constitutes to then use that against you. So the state is also not immune to those sort of trappings as well. So whereas like both times they're doing surveillance, but the effect and experience is very different. And then I'll move on to Anki, and I wanted to talk about like how much of a conversation about the different experiences of women and minorities is there amongst social media companies, and how does that reflect into their sort of community guidelines. And I'd also like to talk about like how certain cases have brought to light how surveillance can put certain people in danger more, and how social media platforms are sometimes more culpable than they should be in these instances. For example, it was found that in America, the ACLU last year filed a petition against an application called Geophidia, where and they were taking information from Facebook and Twitter and Instagram were providing them information, and that application was being sold to marketed to police authorities to clamp down on Black Lives Matter activists. And eventually, like the ACLU then they said that after that, then as soon as this came to light, the social media companies withdrew that sort of. But this kind of like potential for abuse, and this was current recently in Pakistan. There was a case where this woman was sharing her experience of being attacked online. Being attacked offline, but she was sharing her the progress of her case continuously on her Facebook profile, and how she was being the challenges that she was facing in the legal system. And those posts were then reviewed by Facebook and taken down. And so how that sort of algorithm of the social media companies can be changed to make sure that these kind of incidents don't happen, that if somebody continuously reports it, and that sort of speech is not taken down. I'm sorry, my question was a bit long.
These are all valid questions. So I would like to start off by making 3 points. I think there are two fundamental approaches. One is when you talk of surveillance and particularly when it comes to women and minorities. Also, there is this, at least in the South Asian context, there is a very important question of access to resources, because that has been a long-standing problem. The reason women don't have participation in order to be able to negotiate these spaces better is because the anemic composition of the statistics which you see when you look at number of women online as compared to men. I mean, I can talk about India, and I think it's reflected in the similar proportionality in the rest of South Asia as well, because in India, if you look at the composition of the internet per se, only 24% women are there. Rest of them are all men. So if there is going to be patriarchal domination, then obviously it's the same thing about the public safety concept, right? Even in the offline world, you need more women on the road in order to make sure that our public spaces are safe. Otherwise, you will have the kind of behavioral, sort of dysfunctionality in terms of physical safety being under threat, in terms of, sort of the normalization of violence, which Mehtab talked about, through assault and rape, etc. And we see that all the time in my country also. So I think there is this very fundamental issue of access to resources, which we cannot just wish away. We'll have to acknowledge that. If you're looking at fundamental curative solution in terms of the internet being this more equal space, there has to be a very focused effort in terms of bringing more women online. In speaking to groups like the FAT, which is the Feminist Access to Technology, which is a very sort of energetic and innovative grassroots group of women in tech engineers in India, as well as looking at other work in the region in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and others, what we found working with these groups and in our research is that typically what happens if you look at a device as an internet, if you basically are on a data plan, and if you have a son and a daughter, in most of these countries, in most of these societies, you will give the data plan to your son and not to your daughter. So you're chilling access to resources right at get-go when children are very young. And then when women and girls do get access to resources in terms of a data plan or a mobile device, it's essentially a shared device. It's either a hand-me-down or it's somebody you're sharing it with. And it could be a male relative, it could be a brother, or somebody, a sibling who's older to you, and therefore there is a certain power structure of the family where they have these surveillance powers, which are, because of normalization and again because social norms, are the dominant culture. And it takes a while before those kind of things change. And you see a manifestation of all this online. Like, it takes time, it takes a lot of work to change this. So what we've been doing is that we've been working a lot with campaign groups in India and in South Asia. We are, as you know, we have been in regular conversation with Nikhat and others in Pakistan. In India, we did a very interesting campaign, which is essentially he for she. We did that work with groups like Center for Social Research, where they sort of talked about the language which men should have when they're talking to women. What is that counter speech which you need to create in order to make sure that the internet as a space is a safer and a more civil space? This entire notion of women need to be watched, that how that construct needs to be reorganized and rethought of. There's also another campaign which we supported with Breakthrough, which essentially is a group of grassroots videographers, cinematographers, people who are in the area of creative arts and literature, essentially to do a day-long hack for change, which essentially celebrated new models, new role models, so that the millennials have something else as a referencing point. And then a lot of this video content went viral on the platform and just created that kind of engagement with the youth population. Your second question was in terms of how are social media platforms and internet companies on the industry side thinking about this particular issue of surveillance from a gendered lens perspective. I think bringing women online is a very important priority for all companies, whether it's Google, whether it's us, whether it's anybody, right? There is a very strong focus on that. There have been corporate statements and investments which are programmatically being made in terms of making sure that we are working with the community and other people who are invested in these efforts. We are also at the same time looking at our community standards very closely by talking to the community, by talking to civil society organizations, which is why all industry participates in the IGF discussion forums to hear feedback. and use that as a listening mechanism in order to look at the refinement or the sort of the evolution of the community standards, and we take that feedback. In terms of the automation mistakes which you talk about, yes, we do make mistakes, and sometimes, you know, there are automation misfires which do happen. In this instance which you refer to in Pakistan, that was flagged to us by our local civil society network, which then was reviewed, because as an intermediary, it's a notice and take down system, right? You report to us, we review it. The language competencies which come into play, there is this nuance of language also which is very important, and therefore you need to have people with language competencies also looking at those reports. Once those report was flagged to us, it got reviewed, and those posts, as you are aware, was reinstated, right? Like, and we apologized. And this is something which we've been very upfront about. We've been very public about and said we made a mistake, and these has been then reinstated. In terms of looking at surveillance broadly, I think what is happening in the region a lot is that, and I think globally also, but I think what is happening regionally more so, there's increased polarization, as we all know, in terms of different points of view. Like, differences have never been so polarizing as they are today, at this moment. And therefore, in that context, when you look at the role of the state in terms of using national security as a justification, or public safety as a justification to surveil, that becomes very problematic. Facebook's approach in terms of countering or agitating against state surveillance is very well captured in the coalition which we joined a few years back with the rest of the industry, which is called reformgovernmentsurveillance.org, where we basically push back in a very, very big way to mass surveillance, and this is extremely well documented. We actually joined up in a suit in the US, as you know, when those leaks became public, and filed an opposition in terms of making sure, and we are always responsive in terms of the feedback which we get in terms of refining our community standards. So that's what I would say in terms of what we are doing programmatically and also at a policy level in terms of responding to these needs which are getting surfaced to us. And lastly, of course, and you talked about that, I think privacy regulation development is happening in a lot of these countries. I mean, I don't know what the status is in Pakistan, but in India we definitely are looking at there's an active consideration in terms of looking at a full-fledged data protection law and a privacy regulation law. I think to the extent that there are principles and also informed consent, the type of informed consent is defined in a national legislation, which then has some degree of harmonization with global standards that gives certainty to both citizens of the world and also to different cultures and also to companies in the context in which, in the framework in which they have to operate in.
Thank you so much, and everybody was quite on time. So we have some time for questions. I have some myself, but I'd be less selfish and open it up to the floor. So we'll take, I think, 4 questions at once and then get them answered and see how time is and then revisit. So who would like to ask a few questions? Yeah. Yeah. No.
Since we talk about building counter narratives to deal with sort of dominant online narratives, I'm very curious if any of you have thought about the idea of counter surveillance from a feminist perspective, and if so, what would that mean, and is it even feasible, and just any thoughts?
I'm not sure what you would count as counter surveillance, but would you count tech solutions as counter surveillance, like safety apps for women?
I mean, I guess it could be. So one of the things I was thinking about, this is just to, is, you know, I went to Bhutan last year, and I went to this ruins, right? And I was looking around, and there were these 2 young men. And I was the only person there, and I was getting jittery because they were, coming quite close to me. And so I just said, okay, let me put my cell phone on them and just sort of photograph them. Now, it's not that they were doing anything to me, but in a sense, I was feeling powerless. So I don't put myself in the position of the surveilling, because you need to have a certain power to be able to surveil. But I was trying to use the cell phone as a mechanism of counter surveillance from my position of powerlessness to sort of equate the thing. It's not a well thought through thing. I was just curious. Yeah.
I think your example actually illustrates a very important point, which is that technology empowers. And because you had the power to take their picture and post it just like anyone else, you are in a position to call them out very publicly. And online spaces allow us to do that, which I guess you could make that a norm in the sense that, and we've seen examples of that online where women have posted pictures of men who sent them obscene messages, or women who post pictures of men who've harassed them in offline spaces and asked people around to share the post so that they could identify them. So definitely that could become a practice, and I think that the use of technology to defend yourself is very empowering.
Okay, take control, huh? Take back the tech. Take control of the technology. And I would like to expand, because it's true. Technology empower, and women can use and fight back or build up to the next level. But there is also, we live in a very paradox. And I think we can be all innocent, or we can be only together responsible, but there are degree of responsibility. Why I'm saying so? Because, in a world of surveillance, you feel compelled to comply and to behave like the nice woman, the nice girl, And so we create a world that reinforces what we want to change. Because if I fear the attack, if I've been surveilled and then punished, if I will be diminished, then I'm forced to put up a behavior that again reinforces. And then we live in a constant hierarchy of what is relevant. So expression of idea, it's here. Sexual expression, it's here. Because sexual expression is not enough an idea. And in all this degree and all this game, we continue to lose, and we are always in delay. Yes, technology empower, but all this analysis that we do, they require data. We all collectively provide data, but who controls and owns the data? The wealth of knowledge that big corporation or government has to understand behavior, the why of things, to understand where things turn bad, it's incomparable. So to raise class society, now we have a new category, are the data brokers. The one that can analyze and the one that hosts the data, they have power. They can determine when we go. And again, the algorithm is designed because my post is not following a timeline. It's not the last most important. It's built up. It's crunched in a very specific way of showing. So I can cry for help. But if I'm in the ocean, no one will hear me. So how we can make sure that we are in the ocean but with an amplifier?
I actually have a follow-up question to that. Like, if we are to weaponize surveillance, to use it against as counter-surveillance, that raises, maybe this is a theoretical question, but is surveillance inherently bad? And if it is, then can we, what are the politics of us using it as a weapon for counter-surveillance? And anybody in the audience can also take this up. Are we, is this, like, because maybe we need to tackle this, like, is surveillance inherently a bad thing? And then maybe this can answer that ethical question about counter-surveillance.
So, Shamla and also Bishaka, to your point, I think what happens in South Asia, that the existential nature of safety for women is such a this moment and today issue that one could argue there is a scope and reason for doing the kind of stuff which Bishaka was suggesting, or I think the way sort of public access tools like social media platforms have been utilized for naming and shaming these kind of sort of perpetrators or some of the harassers has had a disciplining impact in terms of reshaping norms, or at least has been able to expose. I will give you one data point. If you look at the if you just look at the longitudinal series in terms of the number of rape cases which would get reported 10 years back and the number which cases get reported now, there would be a difference, night and day difference. Like pick up the National Crime Records Bureau statistics of any of our countries in South Asia, and you will see the difference. I think it has happened because these things are on, these are the discussions, these are uncomfortable discussions in our cultures, but this is a discussion at the table. Women are sitting at the table, they're talking about it, and I think there is this entire notion of giving voice to this harm, which is why I think there is a case in terms of looking at safety apps, which you talked about, and also I think just the voice, women having voice in order to expose a lot of this, using the naming and shaming tools in different ways have acted as a countermeasure to make sure that women have more access to these spaces.
Just on the because safety apps came up, we did a study in India called Gendering Surveillance, which looked at surveillance from a gender perspective. And in that we analyzed about 50 safety apps, and what we found was that a lot of them are like, safety is constructed as a prize for good behavior, and in a lot of ways it leads to a lot of it is designed around partner surveillance. It is designed in a way that you're giving someone the power to you're I'm sorry, I'm just losing my train of thought, but essentially it's either someone that you know that the panic alert goes out to, or the police, or in some other cases networked publics, like it could go to Facebook, etc. So all three of these can come with different problems, and when all the government funds set up for women's safety go into either CCTV cameras or panic buttons, it can be extremely problematic in the absence of other measures. So we look at that in more detail, and we find that safety apps are quite problematic. Also because they construct safety as a very, they don't think of safety beyond very, I don't know, ancient notions of safety. They don't think of data security, like the apps that basically know, you're supposed to turn on your location, right? So each and every place that you go to gets recorded. And keeping that safe, if you look at if you look at their privacy policy, it's basically 2 lines, or half of them don't even have it. So the safety of all that data that you're giving is nowhere in a safety app that is released by the police. And like, there's this, it's another matter that there's 50 different police safety apps also themselves. So I think we should be careful about pushing for more safety apps, because like there's, I think 15 safety apps only by the name of Nirbhaya. So you could just like, Nirbhaya, be powerful, no more Nirbhaya, this, that, so lots of that. Sorry, I have just, I think one more question, not a comment. So we know that narratives of safety and surveillance are closely coupled, and in our another case study which we did was on mobile phone bans in India, in certain parts of India, and there we found that mobile phones create a space for privacy which breaks down social surveillance that has existed. So you no longer know who your daughter is texting, whether she is talking to someone outside of your caste or your religion. So this creates a lot of social anxiety around traditional systems of surveillance where you could keep a control on the body of your women, right? So there we find that women are really subversive in using the arguments against like powerful people in the family. Like for example, the very narrow instances where mobile phones are allowed for young girls is when they go out to college, because you know it's for safety. So the women also in the interviews said that yeah, we managed to get phones because, you know, it's for safety. They do like 20 other things, but what they want to tell their parents and say is because, you know, you want me to be safe, right? So I was wondering if in your helpline that you mentioned, if you've come across any interesting, exciting, subversive things that women do to counter surveillance. Thanks.
So I don't want to talk too much about this, but we actually looked at like a lot of studies that you do, and we're like really big fans of the work that you guys do. I think you should have been on here now that we're connected. So I think, but I think we got like this really cute case where this woman called us, and she her first question was she was a bit older, so she asked us what is who owns Facebook, and we were just really confused, and we're like, what do you mean? Like, I guess there's a complicated ownership structure. Like, no, give me the phone number of the person who owns Facebook. So old people in technology. So we were like, we don't have the personal phone number. So she got really agitated. And she said, but we were like, but why do you need the phone number of Mark Zuckerberg? So she said that I want to suggest an amendment into like Facebook's permissions, and that women should have access to their husbands' accounts. And we said, I don't know if that's possible. Maybe you can try emailing him. And so that was really interesting how you were talking about how like she was also surveilled, like she wanted to use that surveillance as well. So maybe like that gender doesn't necessarily mean protect you from that surveillance. We haven't had any of those sort of, but this is a common experience where a lot of women have told us that the only phone that they own, they leave at the office in their drawer, and they don't take it home because there's a they won't be allowed, or it'll be surveilled if because they'll probably go through the messages, their family members and things like that. So they come up with these innovative solutions to sort of bypass that. So because it's only 5 more minutes, I'd like everybody to get a say yes.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. My name is Luis. I'm from Malaysia. My question is the abuse that Malaysia woman suffers is way more than the Malaysian man. And one of the reasons is because Malaysia is a Muslim-dominant country, and a lot of women has been subjected to racist remarks and also criticism for not wearing the hijab, because that is to them not as observing one of the pillars of the Islamic of Islam. But the problem with that, and to the extent that there's even a gymnast who won like 6 medals in Southeast Asian Games, but she was still criticized because she's a Muslim woman and she wore a leotard, which is quite revealing of her thighs, and she was abused online, and that's how bad Malaysia's situation is. But the problem is that I see 2 obstacles to improving that situation. Firstly, it is the religion itself, because religion dictates how a woman should dress. So there, as I think Valentine correctly pointed out, surveillance not only from top down, like from the government, but among the citizens themselves. Men surveilling how women should dress, how women should behave, how they should behave around men, otherwise they will be called names and everything. And second obstacle would be women themselves, women who criticize other women for not dressing up as they should. I don't know how to move on from this and improve the treatment for people. Thank you.
If we can get the second question in and then combine.
It's actually to answer to yours about the ethical issues of surveilling back. There's actually a term for that called surveillance, where you use surveillance as a resistance mechanism. And personally, I don't see an ethical issue in that, mainly because surveillance at the end of the day is about power. And when you surveil back, then you're taking it back and you're trying to balance the power a little more. So in that case, is it ethically wrong? I mean, they're surveilling you, so you surveil them, and someone has to, like, there's a question of who watches the watchers, right? It's like that. And that's what I personally think. And there are actually examples of this which happen in India. Like there are lists which I know certain queer communities run about colleges which have homophobic professors. So they circulate the list among, like, you know, on a need to know basis, so that students don't get into trouble with those particular professors, with their viewpoints or any of that. Which I think is surveillance, yes, but it's helping. It's helping correct the power dynamic a little more. And that's one example which I could think of immediately, having like seen those lists. That's why I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
And maybe like you can answer the questions, or maybe just have closing comments, so we can just wrap the. So everybody can like sort of go around. Okay. Whoever wants to go first.
Okay, sure. I think we got some very thought-provoking comments, especially with regards to impacting cultural change as far as surveillance is concerned. I want to go back to what Jamila said, which is a really good question about whether surveillance is inherently bad, and what do we define as offensive surveillance, because we can't deny, as Valentine explained at the beginning of the session, that we all you know, go and stalk someone's profile, or we all watch, you know, what kids others are up to.
Watch kids also.
Yeah, and we are all guilty of judgment, but I'll just add a legal perspective to it. Privacy has been conceived of in terms of the its constitutional limits as being confined within the walls of your house. So within the walls of your house, nobody can intrude, and this has traditionally been related to the state. So the state can't intrude upon your person, your property, without a warrant or without good reason. But now in the online spaces, the walls have come down. There are no virtual walls either, unless you count platforms where you specifically add people or you know, have closed accounts. But since these barriers have changed, we have to ask ourselves what kind of surveillance was going on that has been made easier, what kind of surveillance should continue, what powers the state should have, and what safeguards should exist within the law and the constitution to prevent abuse. But obviously we also have to start considering non-state actors because they are part and parcel of surveillance of disadvantaged groups. You know, how women are treating other women and shaming them, or how people think that just because they hold a certain religious viewpoint that they're free to express it abusively to someone else.
So I will not answer as an agnostic person to the question, because I'm sure there are so many groups of women that articulate wonderfully around religion, around faith, and around power. But I would suggest each and every man of Malaysia to raise his voice and to protect and to dissent, because the community of dissent is the one that level. On the rest, I would say hack. And I'm very happy about our conversation because we didn't stay to the problem. We know that we are surveilled, but we hack the system. Each and every individual, each and every woman, girl, LGBT, anyone that has several forms of discrimination, and take the power and re-hack back. Because the girls that say it's for my safety, she say with a great sense of humor. And that ability to reverse patriarchy is the ability to contest the surveillance, any kind of surveillance. But we don't have to forget the issue of power. I am completely irrelevant. It's the ones who own the data, the ones who organize the data. Algorithms make discrimination. Algorithms are the main amplifier of what we see. And algorithms help and support the creation of the mob. So we need to hack the algorithms. To hack the algorithm, we need you, because you own the algorithms. And we need to have open algorithms to see what and how they're built. Because if we build in that equality, respect, love, then we will not have the mob, because the mob will be called to solidarity, not to angst.
I think the transparency point overall is a discussion which has been an ongoing process, and you also know that. This is something I think all companies are have cognizance of, and I think forums like this then give an opportunity to have those continuing conversations. I think the way the transparency journey has, I would call it a journey because there's no end point. It's a constant improvement process, and I think this entire point of algorithmic transparency is something which is an ongoing discussion which is going on, and we look to opportunities and multi-stakeholder forums such as the IGF to make progress on these conversations.
Okay, so that concludes our panel. I hope it was fun for you, and thank you to the audience. There were some really good points coming through. So yeah, thank you everyone.
So on 31st, if you are in Bangkok, there is a feminist pop-up. We will talk of the feminist principle of the internet. It's all over the internet. We need the feminist solidarity.